Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. You are signed up for the Land Access for Speakers. This is, or for Seekers, I'm sorry. This is hosted by MIFS, Michigan Food and Farming Systems, and it's going to be facilitated by Kathy Ruhf from Land for Good. She's the Senior Program Director. The ability for us to put this webinar on is from the Beginning Farmer Rancher Development Program. We got a grant a few years back that is allowing us to do this. And the partners on that grant are Center for Regional Food Systems, Michigan Student Organic Farms, and then MIFS. There are a few events coming up in the next couple of months. I will send out an email to the people who registered for this with those links to those land access opportunities that are coming up, including the 2 webinars tomorrow. I'm sure that you all saw those. We also have an event coming up on February 2nd for transitioning farmland to the next generation of farmers, and then the 15th Annual Michigan Family Farms Conference on February 3rd. Thank you so much for muting yourself. This webinar is being recorded and will be available online when it is done. If you have any questions during the webinar, go ahead and type them into the chat bar, and we will take a few moments during the webinar to answer those questions. And then we would really appreciate it at the end of the webinar. We'll send out an evaluation link, and if you could do that, if you could complete that evaluation, that would be really helpful for us in the future. Again, this webinar is being facilitated by Kathy Ruhf. Kathy, thank you so much for being here. Please go ahead and take it away.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I think there's about a dozen of us on the call today. I see your names, and I welcome you putting a sentence or so in the chat box about your land access or land tenure situation, what you're hoping to get from this particular webinar. I've been pleased to work with MIFS over the last couple of years through their Beginning Farmer Grant on access to land programming for Michigan. I work for an organization called Land for Good. We are based in New England, and we work directly with farm seekers as well as landowners and transitioning farm families in New England and beyond. So we do have educational events. We held a national conference earlier this year on land tenure. We do consulting as well. I am not a farmer. I do not come from a farm family. I have been working in the nonprofit sector around beginning farmers and land access and tenure for about 30 years now, and I'm always learning something new. At Land for Good, we help farm seekers understand their tenure options and work with assessing land, leases, lease agreements, and other kinds of negotiations. We also help farm families with succession and transfer planning, and we work with landowners to make their land available for farming. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges involved with land access, and I'm sure you are familiar with them. And then we're going to talk about what tenure means and what some of the options are, and how to assess land, how to find land, and we'll leave some time at the end for further questions and discussion. But as I say, I have my chat box open, and I welcome your questions and comments along the way. So come on, go to the next one. Okay, so the challenges are not unfamiliar to you. Land values in many parts of the country and in your state are quite competitive, and often purchasing is not an option. Even competition for rental land can be pretty steep, especially if you're looking at operations that require more acreage. Many new farmers are coming from non-farm backgrounds, so compared to how it's been a couple of generations ago, where the farm just simply went to the eldest son, typically, new farmers these days don't have farms to go back to. Even furthering the problem is that the farmer population is aging, and far too few farmers adequately prepare for farm transition. and many do not have identified successors, which postpones their facing reality even more. So on the one hand, that's an enormous challenge. On the other hand, it is an opportunity for those with non-farm backgrounds to try to be matched up with farmers who are looking for a successor. In our country, we have a strong cultural bias toward private property ownership. And even within the farming community, people sometimes think they're not real farmers unless they own their land. In fact, about half of U.S. farmers rent some or all of the land that they farm. And one of the significant studies that I always quote that the Economic Research Service at USDA did found that beginning farmers without land debt are more likely to be successful in the long run. So even though many farmers desire to own their land, which is a very acceptable and admirable vision, it may not be the best strategy, at least in the beginning. On top of that, there are not very many support services for land access, although that is changing in recent years. In fact, more and more agency people and policymakers are realizing that land access and transfer are among the biggest challenges facing farmers in any region and any state. Oftentimes we talk about land affordability, but as many of you probably know, especially in the more desirable peri-urban markets, housing is at least as big a deal as access to land. And then finally, even though you may know exactly what you're looking for, it's really hard to find properties. There aren't the same kinds of realtor access services as there are in housing for farmland, even in agricultural states. So when we talk about tenure, tenure means to hold. And whether you purchase or rent, you need access. And now that seems obvious. We talk about land access in broad terms. But in this case, I mean the ability and opportunity to use the land and its suitability for your purposes. Doesn't help you very much if somebody says, well, I have this great hayfield back here that you can use, but you can't really get to it with your machinery. It's not the proper scale. It's too far from your home farm or whatever. So just because it's there doesn't mean it's right for you. People talk about security as a very key element of land tenure, and of course it is. And ownership is the most secure form of land tenure. But if you're not going to own the farm, it may be that a long enough lease is adequate security for you. It also may be that in your early years of farming, when you're not completely convinced about how or where or why you want to farm, it may be that a short-term lease gives you the exact amount of flexibility that you need, and you don't need more security than that. Most important, if you're not going to own the land, is that you have an equitable and clear division of rights and responsibilities. So who's responsible for what, and what are your rights on property that you don't own? And we'll get into that a little bit more. So oftentimes people talk about land affordability. And in my mind, it's not the question of the land being cheap. It's a question of what the farmer can afford. If those of you on the call had $1 million, then a lot of land would be affordable to you. If you didn't, then affordability becomes much more of a pressing issue. So affordable means what's economically feasible for you, and it may be more affordable to rent than to purchase. Finally, you need ways to build and redeem equity, which may not necessarily be in the land. People often talk about, well, if you lease, you can't build equity as if you were owning the land. And that's true, but there are other ways to take to invest your assets, and you may be able to build equity in operating assets and your business and be able to purchase land down the road. So who owns what and how the equity is built in your various assets are really more to the point. So as I said, tenure means to hold, and it really comes from a very personal place for you and your family. Your values and beliefs around property, private property ownership, what legacy means to you, and is it important? How important is it for you to own the ground that you're farming, or own all of the ground that you're farming in terms of a long-term legacy? What are your personal goals, your family goals, and your business goals with respect to land? And there are some farmers that don't see land ownership as an important priority for them. As long as they have adequate security, they may have political or cultural beliefs about land ownership. So the purpose of this discussion right now is just to open up your minds to think about, well, what really matters to me about land ownership, and about the practicalities of where you place your equity as you are building your farm business. So there are really two big, there's one fork in the road, and you either own or you don't own the land. And if you own the land, under what terms and conditions is that ownership? And if you don't own it, similarly, under what terms and conditions? And to think about the bigger picture, you can own, you can have some of each. In other words, you might own the home farm and rent additional land, which, as you know, many, many farmers do. Or you might own your house and rent the land, or you might own everything. And in fact, it can change over time. If you think about a farming career path, you're scaling up your operation, and somewhere along the way, you might be changing your market or your production practices or your location. And so your tenure path might roughly parallel your career path as well. And what you choose as your tenure path needs to fit your business plan, and your ability to finance your land tenure situation is going to be reflected in your overall business approach. And like anything in a creative enterprise, you need to make room for revisions. As I mentioned, affordability of farmer housing is really key, not just for you, but for your labor or apprentices. And it could be for other members of the family if you're growing the operation or more than one family is involved in your operation. So some things to think about are whether you want a separate lease, and there are some state laws that apply in terms of tenancy, residential tenancy, and tenants' rights. And then also to think creatively, as many of the farmers that we work with do, in terms of a trailer or other kinds of movable structures, shared housing, and then a ground lease, which I think I go into a little bit later in these slides. Essentially, a ground lease is where you rent the ground and you own the improvements, such as a house and or other farm buildings on the property. So obviously the advantages of owning, as I've talked about, are maximum security, a way to build equity. You can use the land as collateral. It does present a meaningful and obvious legacy, and people who own their own land have extremely strong emotional ties. And finally, you don't have a landlord. On the other hand, you're tying up much of your capital. You're going into debt. For some people, the permanency is a liability, especially if you wind up changing your mind. I can't tell you how often somebody has said, well, I've bought this farm and I love it, but it turns out it's really not the right farm for us. And so there they are. Not that you can't sell it, but it's just it's a big production to have to undo a purchase. And there's the ongoing and not inconsiderable responsibility of owning property. Oops. Yeah, okay. So people often talk about a path to ownership, and broadly that might mean that you first start to rent and then you down the road you own. In this particular slide, I'm talking more particularly about the way to acquire title to a particular property over time. And here we have 4 methods to do that. If you really are committed to the property that you are farming now, you can have provisions in your lease or in a separate agreement, what people sort of commonly call lease to own. Lease to own is not an actual legal term, it's a concept. And the typical 2 ways to do that is through a right of first refusal, which is to say if the landowner ever chooses to sell the property, you get first dibs. Or a purchase option, which is actually a formal agreement that says at a certain time certain and for a price that is or will be determined, you purchase the property. A land contract is a little bit similar to lease to own, where in lease to own, the land, where in a land contract, the title remains with the seller until you have completed most or all of the payments to the seller, as compared to a mortgage where you are also in debt to pay off the property, but the title transfers to you. Land contracts are quite typical between generations in a family. In fact, USDA has a land contract guarantee program, which is intended to increase the popularity of land contracts, but it's very rarely used. Another way to acquire ownership in a particular property over time is through a business entity, such as a limited liability company, where you would share in the interests of the property with the landholder, the landowner, and so you would be a small percent landowner, and gradually through whatever the transfer mechanism is, it could be your sweat equity, a purchase, or a gift, you would acquire additional interest in that land until at some point in the future, all the interests transfer to you through that entity. Or if you're lucky, you could be gifted a portion of the interest in the property over time. So the final, the second fork in the road is around tenancy. And basically this flow chart, if you can read it, apologies for the small type, talks about the situation in which eventually you have ownership, and we just went over that in the box on the lower left, or you would not ever have an ownership option, in which case various kinds of leases are an option for tenancy. You also can have a license or a permit. Now, strictly speaking, to have a license or a permit on land, you are not a tenant, because a license or a permit are not the same as a lease. The difference essentially being a legal nuance in which a license is permission to use a property and a lease is actually a legal interest in the property. One of the operational differences is a license is easier to revoke than to break a lease. Mostly those don't exist, except for in some public land. For example, in Massachusetts, where I live, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts does rent land to farmers, only they do it under a permit situation because they are not allowed by law to convey an interest in real property. That may be more detail than you need, but it's just to say there are options out there. So within tenancy, we've got a basic short-term lease, and that can be anything from 1 to 3 years, basically. There are standard clauses, which we'll get into. A long-term lease clearly gives you more security, possibly more rights, and can be anything from a few years to up to 99 years. And as I mentioned, the ground lease is another variation of a lease where you rent the ground and you own the improvements existing on it. You purchase them or you build them and own them. It's not dissimilar at all from a commercial lease, although people think that a ground lease is sort of out there a little bit. Between private parties, it's not very common. It's more common when a land trust, a community land trust in particular, acquires the land and then enables a ground lease with the farmer. Talked about a license or a permit, and then people also talk about, other ways to get onto land and start farming, and you could very well be an employee. You would not be a tenant. You would be salaried by the organization or the landowner to be a manager, and that's a perfectly legitimate way to get onto land. It offers you a good many benefits that being on your own land would not. On the other hand, you don't get quite the same feeling of legacy or ownership. So in the universe of leasing land, there are lots of different kinds of landowners and landlords. And again, this laundry list is just to inspire you to think about where's the property and who could you partner with. Private landowners include non-farming landowners, called by USDA non-operator landowners, or NOLOs. And what's interesting is that over 80% of farm landlords are not farmers. So that's a big universe out there. They are farm widows. They can be next generation heirs who are not farming. They can be owners of large estate properties. And then there's the other category of people that are in fact farming and are looking to get out and are looking for someone else to take over their land and or their operation. So in addition to private landowners, there are a lot of public entities at the municipal, county, state, or federal level. Conservation Land Trust is a land trust that's particularly interested in natural resource conservation as compared to a community land trust, which is particularly or originally in the movement more interested in affordable housing. And as I mentioned, a community land trust, some of them engage in agricultural land and housing as well. There can be other nonprofit or non-governmental organizations that hold land, anything from educational institutions to community-based organizations. I just heard of one community development corporation in New Jersey that acquired land through purchase from the city, and then they are leasing that land to farming entities. Some of you have heard more about investor entities, investment firms, and they span a wide range from those that are quite large and invest in agricultural property nationally and internationally as a portfolio diversification strategy. There are others such as Iroquois Valley Farms and Dirt Capital, just to name a couple, Farmland LP as well, that focus on farmland and really trying to do well by the farmer to create good partnerships, often under lease-to-own situations. Intentional communities such as co-housing and other even subdivisions that allow for farming also should not be ruled out. Yes, a copy of this PowerPoint can be made available. And thank you for the information, for the comment on the information on the slides. So what are landowner concerns? Well, as you might imagine, most typically landowners are concerned about liability, which can be addressed in the content of a lease by requiring the tenant to obtain liability insurance and naming the landowner as additional insured. Landowners are concerned about getting stuck with someone that isn't working out, and that can also be addressed in the body of a lease. Landowners sometimes have very specific concerns and desires about how the property looks, whether they can get onto the land. Sometimes they want to have a shared use, like be able to have a barn party annually that they've had in their family forever, or have a wedding on the property, or be able to store their antique car in a portion of the barn. So landowners can reserve their rights and interests. It has to be mutually agreeable. And most landowner concerns can be addressed. On the other hand, I can't overemphasize enough, if you are engaging in a lease discussion, to really take seriously and validate landowners' concerns. So lease doesn't have to be super complicated. In fact, for a very simple lease, there are 5 elements that constitute a legal contract, and they are named right there. You need the official names of the parties, so that if the landowner is an organization, it needs to name the organization. If your farm is an LLC, it needs to name the LLC if that's who's doing the renting. You need an accurate description of the premises, and that can be quite simple or quite elaborate. For example, if you're renting a whole farm and it has structures on it, you would do yourself well to make sure that you've described the condition of those buildings and possibly even include photographs, just so that you have a baseline down the road when it comes to discussing repairs, maintenance, and improvements. The term simply means when it starts and stops. Consideration is a fancier legal term for the rent. Sometimes people say, well, they're not charging me rent. If there isn't an exchange of consideration, it's not a legal contract. So even if it's $1, you need to be able to say what the exchange of value is to make it a legally binding contract. Sometimes people say, well, I'm not paying rent. They ask for a share of my CSA. You need to monetize that because that's a non-monetary, but it is a consideration. Sometimes it could be a service that you've agreed in exchange for using the property that you will maintain the trails or so on. Again, that's an in-kind exchange and that counts as rent. For both the tenant and the landlord, how rent is treated for tax purposes, something that you need to understand, and another reason to monetize the exchange if it isn't in cash right up front. And then the signature of both parties will create a legal document. But there's more. So these bullets I won't go over in a lot of detail, but there are other terms and conditions that can be pretty important in a lease. One of the most important is the permitted and prohibited uses. And that can be quite broad or quite specific. Sometimes the permitted uses can be as simple as saying all generally accepted agricultural practices are allowed. Sometimes the landlord will say, well, you can do everything, but I can't stand chickens. So you're not allowed to have poultry on this farm, or you're not allowed to get closer than 100 feet from this particular stone wall. There can be all kinds of details, and as long as it's mutually acceptable, you can put those into the body of a lease. Most particularly, you want to make sure that prohibited uses are spelled out as well. Are you or are you not allowed to take trees that are creating shade at the edge of your field, or are you allowed to clean out a culvert or a drainage swale, or move an irrigation system? Something that often comes up is, well, I'm going to rent these 20 acres, and I'm also allowed to use this barn over here on the other part of the property. That should actually be a separate use agreement, because if the barn is not inside the leasehold, then the terms of the lease don't apply to something that's not inside the lease. Similarly, if in order to get to your leased premises, you need to go over a road that isn't part of it, you want to make sure that you're addressing by reference or having a separate agreement that you're allowed to access that road and who's responsible for maintaining it. Maintenance and repairs, there's good boilerplate language in a lot of places to say what constitutes maintenance and repairs as distinct from capital improvements and who's responsible for what. Typically, the tenant is responsible for routine maintenance and repairs, and the landlord is responsible for capital improvements. However, you can arrange for the division of those obligations any way that both parties feel is mutually acceptable. I talked a little bit about liability and insurance, and definitely that should be a clause. What you're responsible for and what the landowner is responsible for in liability and casualty insurance. It's important, especially in longer term and a little bit more complicated leases, to have a provision for termination and default. And also, I should have mentioned earlier on under the term for renewal, who's allowed to renew under what circumstances, and what constitutes a default by either party, and what are the conditions under which either party can terminate. Now, if you have a 10-year lease and it says that the term is 10 years, but either party can terminate with a 6-month notice, the question I always ask is, what do you really have as a term? And people will say, well, I have a 6-month term. And that's correct, because if the landlord can terminate at any time, you really don't have the security beyond what's written in the lease. So more often, the lease will allow that the tenant has the right to renew, or the choice to renew, and it's at the tenant's choice, not the landlord's. The landlord's reserved rights, I touched on a little bit. So the landlord most typically would have the right to enter the property for purposes of inspection. You know, they want to be able to see that the land is being managed well and that you are adhering to the terms of the lease. It doesn't mean that they can knock on your door anytime. So usually the lease will say, you know, with prior notification or whatever. And then the reserved rights can be more particular. Sometimes, you know, I've worked on leases where the landlord wants to be quite involved and actually wants to farm, grow a little bit of vegetables over here on this leased property, and as I said, wants to store their, you know, lawnmower and so on. So those need to be negotiated, and sometimes they can be a little bit more tricky about who's sharing the barn and how those decisions get made. If equipment is part of the rental agreement, you can make it a separate rental agreement or bake it into one lease. Again, if the equipment is being rented and it's being shared, that can be pretty thorny, and you just want to make sure you understand and are clear between the two parties how that sharing goes on, who's responsible for maintaining the equipment, what happens when it breaks down, and so on. Taxes and utilities, fairly standard. You do want to be clear about who's paying for water and electricity. Typically, the landlord is responsible for taxes, and also typically the landlord will build in the landlord's expenses into the consideration of the lease fee or the rent. Important in any lease is the process under which permissions and approvals are arrived at. What needs to be in writing. Sometimes it will happen that the parties say, well, I thought you said I could do that. And then the other one says, well, no, I didn't really think you meant that. And even the most cordial of relationships can go sour. So especially with the more significant kinds of decisions, you want to have a paper trail, and you want to be really clear about when approval is granted. Provision for dispute resolution. What happens if you don't agree? Do you agree to a third party coming in and helping out, resolve the dispute? Are you allowed to sublease? Are you allowed to assign the lease to somebody else? Should be written into some leases. And then there's this whole thing about stewardship provisions. Oftentimes landowners care a great deal about how their land is managed, and so do farmers. At the same time, farmers do not want a lease to say, well, you need to specifically farm in this way or plant this kind of cover crop and so on. So a good rule of thumb is to spell out in the lease more broadly what some of the stewardship and land conservation goals are, and then possibly to refer to a plan such as an NRCS conservation plan, a holistic management plan, an organic certification document that can be adhered to the lease as an attachment. You don't want to get into the specifics of how exactly you will farm in the body of the lease. Some states require the lease to be recorded at the Registry of Deeds. That depends on the lease and also, the state and also the length of the lease. Okay, if you have any questions so far, I'm going to take a breath. If there are any questions on some of these details about land tenure options and leasing, put them right up right now. All right, I'm going to go on ahead and talk a little bit about some of the things that come up more and more, and I'm really glad that they do. If, as farmers and as service providers, we believe that a healthy American agriculture needs to be diverse in terms of scale and types of farming and types of farmers, we want to make sure that we lift up the different kinds of farm demographics that are out there, and to recognize that there are histories and contributions, needs and challenges of different farming populations. There's a list of the kinds of populations that in fact need sort of a special attention in terms of structural bias and other kinds of impediments to their acquiring land in the same way that some of the rest of us do. So with that social justice lens, some of those challenges include language and literacy, not only in materials, but in navigating agreements. We recently did a workshop with some Somali and Kenyan farmers, as well as some Bhutanese farmers. They were talking quite candidly about how they want to find land that they can farm together and farm in a community that feels welcoming to them. And as you can imagine, these days, that feels like a much bigger challenge than it has in the past. So some of the language barriers and literacy challenges, even in educational materials, not just lease documents, it's really important to pay attention to. So those communication barriers come up, and sometimes, for example, in that workshop that we did recently, we had translators. So how the workshop progresses, what the PowerPoints look like, that all needs to be customized. Cultural differences in what kinds of land they're looking for, how they would like to farm, what kinds of products they want to grow, also need to be attended to. And then there's not only individual prejudice and biases, but there are institutional biases as well. I work with a service provider in Vermont, which is a pretty white state that has in Burlington a pretty robust immigrant farming population. And there was a landowner who really didn't want to have somebody from that population farming on their land. So that was a pretty tricky discussion to navigate, and we just need to be aware of how to do that, what language to use, how to understand both sides of the challenge there, and to understand the historic context under which immigrant or African American or Native American farmers are thinking about land access and land tenure. And then I mentioned already specific production needs and preferences. So now we're going to shift gears and we'll talk about how to look for land. And as I said in one of the earliest slides, findability is one of the biggest challenges. And we always encourage people to start with the basics. What are your goals and values, and what can you financially afford, which will give you direction about not only where you will need to farm or at what scale. And then to make a search plan. So that starts with what are your goals, where are you looking, and sometimes that needs to be tied to, say, for example, you have a part-time job or your spouse has a job. So the radius is going to be the commutability distance between those other obligations and the farm location. It could be access to markets. If you need to be close to a direct market, that will also describe the radius of land affordability. If you're looking to purchase, that will be a different search plan than if you're open to purchasing or renting. This is a URL for one quite good farm assessment checklist, which is to say what are the things that you're looking for in a property and that you would reasonably take with you when you're actually looking at a property. I'm going to skip ahead here because I don't know. All right, I see what I'm doing. Okay, so one of the worksheets that we tend to hand out to farmers is what we call necessary, desirable, and optional, which is, pardon me for, I'm sorry that I can't, no, I guess I didn't put it in here. The worksheet lists several variables that we're going to go into, and then encourages, it's sort of like a matrix, and it encourages you as the land seeker to say what's absolutely necessary about the land that you're looking for. A good example would be that if you're going to grow high-value specialty crops, vegetables, and so on, you need pretty good and pretty flat land. It's not optional, it's pretty necessary. It might be desirable to have a packing shed on the property, but it may not be absolutely essential because you have another property where you could do that. You could build one on your home property, you could build one on this property so it doesn't have to exist there. Optional might be that it might be nice to have a nice view or a parking area or some of the things that people tend to have in their wish list, but that should not be confused with what's necessary. So it just causes you to think hard about what you absolutely need and what you have some flexibility around in your land search. I was asked to talk a teeny bit about an easement, which is essentially a restriction. Sometimes they're called conservation restrictions on a property, which typically eliminates the right to develop the property for housing or commercial structures. The advantage of a property with an easement is that typically, not universally, typically it reduces the value, the cost of the property, because it's not able to be sold at its highest and best use, which is for development. It does restrict the use against development, but a well-written easement for agriculture should not limit your agricultural activities. In fact, they should support it. But you do need to be very clear about what the easement says, who holds the easement, typically a land trust or a public entity, and what impact that an easement property might have. It's also possible to work with a land trust that might place an easement at the time of your purchase, so that you may actually be the one that's involved in that transaction. So getting back to assessing a farm property that you're going to be looking for, there's some basic key areas, and those are laundry listed there, and we are going to go into them a little bit more. Before we do, I want you to think about what is the driver, and that means what are the factors that are in control. In some cases, as I said, it could be the location. In other cases, it could be some of the natural factors. In some cases, it could be you have to have be close enough to some support services. So I'm going to go into those in a little bit more detail. So in terms of the physical attributes, you obviously have to be able to get onto the property when and how you want to with the equipment that is appropriate for your operation. Is visibility important to you? One time a farmer talked to me about having acquired a farm on a busy road because they wanted to have a visible farm stand. Well, it turned out after a couple of years, they really hated the traffic and really hated dealing with the public as well. So they didn't make a good choice. So that location in terms of where you want to be and how you want people to access or not your farm is an important physical attribute. The climate, obviously, in the macro scale and the micro scale is important, and it's not always easy to determine. Often asking a current or previous farmer about some of those questions, especially around the microclimates, is quite useful and important. What support services do you need and how far away can they be? Is there a veterinarian near enough to the farm that you have your heart set on? Do you have repair or custom services available within a reasonable distance? How are you marketing, and what is the access to the markets? Are there restricted areas on the farm? In some states, there are pretty strict wetlands laws or aquifer protection laws, so you want to make sure that nothing is being restricted or the restrictions are something that you can live with. Are there neighboring farms? Are they compatible with what you intend to do? For example, if you're farming organically, is the neighboring farm likely to be a problem in terms of drift, as an example? So it's not only the physical attributes, but some of the community attributes of a location, the neighborhood and the neighbors and the farming community, location of non-farming services, such as schools and churches. Sometimes those matter a lot to people, and they in fact could be the driver. Sometimes local and state regulations are really important. If you have a unique kind of agriculture, does it count? Does it qualify under a local or state definition of agricultural practices? As I mentioned, what about water regulations? And for example, signage and parking. If you have a CSA or a farm stand, sometimes local regulations are not really compatible with that particular need of yours. In terms of the land base, this is pretty obvious for most farmers, but surprisingly, sometimes farmers don't know enough about how to assess the soils on a property or to understand how to calculate acreage. Is the farm layout conducive to the kind of operation that you want? Is the topography and orientation suited? For example, if you want to do orchard, is the layout and the slope of a particular field appropriate to the kind of tree farming that you want to do? Both water availability and the natural water system on the property. Is there subsurface tile? Is it well maintained? Is access to the barn appropriate? And are there other sensitive features, such as habitat that may be protected or that you would want to protect, or any historic features? Are there invasives? Is there timber on the property, and what is your relationship and your rights with respect to that? I just threw in a screenshot of the Web Soil Survey. If you don't know how to use it, you really should learn about it. It's a great resource. Won't spend time on that right now. So infrastructure, farmers talk a lot about infrastructure, and especially if you're leasing land, what does that mean? Can you put it up? Who owns it? And so on. That's true for water as well as utilities. And sometimes, I know when my son bought his small farm property, access to the internet and cell phone access were almost the main driver. And these days you can understand that that would be the case. So is there electricity? If there isn't, do you need it? Is it metered? How is it being paid for? And so on. Are there buildings? If so, what are their condition? Are they located in the right place? If not, can you build them? Are they suitable? A lot of dairies are going out of business. Is a dairy farm with an old-fashioned stanchion barn something that you could make use of? Are the farm roads in adequate condition? Does equipment come with the property? Is it the right kind of equipment? What about fencing? I mentioned the woodlot. Can you build new? What about alternative energy? We're all thinking a lot more about that. Can you do solar? Are there regulations about it? Is there possible wind power? And so on. Housing, again, we talked about. Is it available? If not, or if it is it appropriate to you and your family's need? What is its condition? Are there options to build new, to have mobile structures? Can you adapt other structures? Can you live nearby? And not only for you, but for your workers as well. What is the history of the property, prior farming uses? Sometimes it's important to find out and really dig deep on chemical use. Are there storage tanks, such as leaky underground storage tanks known as lust? Is there any accident history, not people accidents, but spill accidents? Have there been any non-farm uses, or are there current non-farm uses that would impact? Are there any other liens or encumbrances, right-of-ways owned by the town? I worked on a lease with a farmer recently where the town had considerable rights of way across several fields. And the right-of-way, in fact, allowed for certain cropping, but they couldn't dig too deep, for example. So those are good things to know about. And of course, are there any easements, either conservation or otherwise? So here's that necessary, desirable and optional worksheet that I mentioned earlier on, just so you can get a visual image of how to think about that. So for example, under location, if you remember some of those bullet points there, what would you consider as necessary in terms of your location? In terms of infrastructure, what would be desirable or optional? What would be necessary in terms of housing, and so on. So now we're going to talk a little bit about, now you know what you're looking for, now where to look. And findability is one of the biggest challenges because there is no multiple listing services or Zillow, and in many states or locales there aren't farm link programs. Even where there are, farm link programs are very uneven, and they really don't solve the problem because there are way more properties than there are people who actually post them. So this is just sort of a laundry list to stimulate your thinking about all the places to look. Some states have agriculture commissions or conservation commissions or planning departments, and it certainly doesn't hurt to check with them. Michigan has a land bank program, and Lacey can tell you a little bit about how that works, and that some land has actually been made available for some urban farming. Your Division of Natural Resources, or is it the department? Lacey, I'm forgetting. Anyway, your DNR also has land that it does rent. There are conservation organizations that do make land available, or that know about land through their members, and some of them are quite interested in working lands such as farming and forestry. There are realtors, both for the buyer and for the seller, and in ag dominant states such as Michigan, it wouldn't be hard to imagine that you could find a realtor that could look for you or that would be representing farm properties. And just to push the laundry list further, to make sure that you are using your networks, just like anything else, it's networking that gets the job done most often. I wouldn't rule out farm service organizations, your local FSA and NRCS offices and staff. Often we'll know, for example, about an exiting farmer or a non-farming landowner that might be looking for a farmer. Any of your farm and farm support organizations?
Have a good weekend.
Yeah, if you could mute yourself, thank you very much. And looking in farm publications, sometimes state departments of agriculture, Farm Bureau, and so on have newsletters that in fact have classifieds. So again, if depending on where you're looking and what your resource network is, it's a good idea to look in those kinds of publications as well. And then finally, don't rule out Craigslist, don't rule out the multiple listing services that focus on residences, because often there are farmettes and ranchettes that are listed there. So don't give up on some of the more sort of fringe things that you might be thinking of. There are a few pointers to consider on visiting a property. First of all, do the research on the piece of property. Think about visiting more than once if that can make sense. Check with neighbors and other farmers about the property. By the time you visited 2 or 3, they tend to blur together. So if you tend toward organization, do make a folder, keep a checklist, keep your notes, take photographs, take soil samples if you can, and sometimes water testing is in fact an important thing to check off your list. And finally, or almost finally, to consider making a flyer for yourself and putting out a classified ad. Let the world know what you're looking for and why you would be a great person to sell or lease land to. Make a plan, think outside the box, and use your network. And finally, to be patient. I know that's really frustrating. I do know farmers that are on temporary land, and it takes them a few years to find exactly the right property. Use a team of advisors and partners. Certainly legally, at some point, you'll need an attorney to help you put together or review a lease. And you might find other people that don't charge at the attorney's fee that could help you. In fact, we are just about to launch an online build a lease tool where you could do a lot of the work yourself and then have a lawyer look it over and put their bells and whistles onto it. Financially, you want to work with a financial advisor, a lender such as FSA, Farm Credit, local ag lending bank, or alternative financing entity if you are looking to finance a purchase. Sometimes a land trust can be a really important partner. And as I said, in your search, you might want to add officials and local offices to your team. Sometimes an investor entity could be an important partner, as well as other community stakeholders, USDA offices such as NRCS, and extension educators in a locale. Land for Good is a resource. Even though we're based in New England, we do adapt many of our publications to apply beyond our region. We do have an Acquiring Your Farm online tutorial. I mentioned the Build a Lease that we're about to launch. We also have a guide for landowners that is really a useful tool for you as a land seeker as well. And then finally, I mentioned the soil. I mentioned again the soil survey. So I'm going to take a big breath. Thank you very much for your patience. And now we'll open it up to any questions. You can unmute yourself, or you can put it into the chat box. I will make a copy of the PowerPoint available. Lacey, you and I will work on it. It'll probably be through a link through your MIFS website.
Absolutely, Kathy.
So any questions? Those of you who are still on the call, I would also be interested to know how many of you are thinking about leasing or purchasing, whether thinking this through in the last hour has changed your or opened up your consideration of options, what your biggest concerns are in your land tenure search. Okay, well, it looks like there isn't a lot of chat going on here, Lacey. So do you want to add anything or wrap it up for folks?
Yeah, absolutely. You've definitely got me thinking about some of the things that I've been looking for in land. So I really appreciate that. There is a comment in the box. It says, as an extension educator, that is interesting to help new farmers in the search for land. So thank you, Mariel. We really appreciate that. And hopefully we do have the two other webinars coming up tomorrow. One for families looking to transition, and the other is for service providers that are interested in helping people in this food system, land access, systems work that we're doing. So please tune in for those. Those will also be recorded, and we'll share those as soon as they become complete and available. So I'm looking forward to that. Does anyone else have any comments or questions that they'd like to ask before we close out? Kathy, thank you so much for your facilitation today, and as always, all of your help that you provide for us here in Michigan. Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining today.